Hi, it's Frank. I'm once again talking about melodies, and specifically today I'm looking at the three characteristics that help define melodies even to this day. So it turns out that with the Baroque era and the rise in instrumental music that the 17th century kind of brought with it, all of a sudden we discovered with instruments we could do things we could not do with the human voice. That included things like doing lots of arpeggios or scale passages that were quickly run either going up or down, or for that matter, using extended range in certain instruments, meaning you could go higher or very low compared to like a human voice. As it turns out, these things became quite popular and of course are still popular because instruments proliferated, and specifically really high-grade instruments proliferated, which means they were able to execute things that previous instruments or versions of instruments could not do. So they got easier. Of course, composers were going to make music for it because it was more exciting. Still, in the back of the mind of a lot of composers, though, even to the current day, there's this idea that melodies and melodic writing should originate with stuff that can be done with the human voice. For centuries before the Baroque era, this was the case. We weren't talking about instrumental music anywhere near the way we talk about it after that era. And so that was the main concern. Could somebody actually sing this, either alone or in groups? So with that in mind, the three characteristics that really help define melodic writing, even to this day, are the idea that we have a limited range, usually about an octave, somewhere around there, that the movement we see in melodic notes is conjunct versus disjunct, which is saying stepwise as opposed to skipping around. And usually, melodic writing has to do with short sections. So if we look at the examples that I put together for today, there's three of them. They're the first phrase of three different songs, all from popular genres in US music. And the goal here is to look at them from the point of view of those three considerations. All of these were written with voice in mind, of course. And I grant you, there's plenty of music that's instrumental that breaks these, like I said earlier, and we may get to look at some of those as well. But for now, I just wanted to emphasize how those characteristics are a cornerstone, regardless of era or even genre. So in the case of the first example, we go back to the American folk music of the 50s and 60s, and we see a song called This Little Light of Mine. This one has a total range from lowest to highest note of a sixth. And this melody, just the first four measures of it we get. Notice we have a very clearly and nicely defined phrase there where there's a first half and a second half. First half rises, the second half answers by descending. In the case of the first half, we have some stepwise motion between D to E, and then a small skip from E to G. That sits on a whole note afterwards, and then the descending portion that begins in measure 3 is literally just scalar. It starts on B, goes to A, and then G, the tonic of the key we're in. All these examples, by the way, the ones in the PDF are in the key of G. So this is a great example of the three characteristics I mentioned. That's why I wanted to lead off with it. It's got that limited range of a total of a sixth, meaning if you started on the G note and went up a sixth, that's as far away as the range you would have to deal with. In addition to that, if you're looking at this from the point of view of movement, as I said, you've got lots of stepwise movement with just a little bit of skipping in there. Beyond that, we've got two very definite sections that are easy to see. The first two measures, second two measures. Together they form that opening phrase. The next example I was going to talk about is from the Beatles song Yesterday by Paul McCartney. This one, once again, emphasizes the characteristics I was talking about, but in a slightly different way. This one, of course, sounds like in the key of G. I hate to stop there, of course. Everyone knows that melody so well. But that's the first four measures of it. The idea here is that we're opening with the tonic note, preceded, interestingly enough, on the very first beat by the supertonic, the A in the key of G in this case. So a little extra tension comes right from the start. And then that's it. That's all we get after the half note there on the second beat. In the second measure, we get a little ascending scale pattern, which happens to be all but one note of the E melodic minor scale. In this case, the note A is missing. But it's scalar, which means it just moves from one note to the next in the scale, one letter to the next letter of the alphabet in this case. Measure 3 has only two notes, once again separated by just a step, the F sharp to E. And interestingly, because the Beatles were very good at this, the fourth measure highlights the downward version of the E melodic minor scale, which happens to mirror the form of natural minor. That is to say, it includes the notes E, D, C, B, A. And it just does one note after the other in descending fashion. So once again, we have kind of a rising and going down kind of thing, between the second and the fourth measure. We saw some of this in the first example. But more to the point of those three characteristics, we've got the limited range. Again, the lowest note in this example is G, going up to the octave of that. We've got the scale-wise movement that's stepping instead of skipping. And then we have some short sections. The scale rising part that I talked about is in measure 2, which leads to a measure that has just two notes in it that descend by only a half step apart. And then at the end, in the final measure, we get another scale pattern that's descending. So again, another good example of sectional kind of writing. This phrase breaks into two halves. In the third example, what I have here is the first four measures of the Taylor Swift song Wildest Dreams. This is in the key of G, but interestingly, this particular part of the song emphasizes different chords. Within that key, it emphasizes the subdominant, submedian, and dominant. So while we don't have the tonic chord represented, the tonic note is. In the very first measure, what we have starting there is. So there's the first four measures, the opening part of it. Notice that if you're looking at the PDF there, in the first measure we only have two notes, and they're just tonic and the supertonic, first and second degree of the scale. After that, when we move to measure 2, we get a group of eighth notes in the second half, which does include a skip. In fact, the biggest skip we've seen so far, specifically as we move from the A, B, B, E, E, D into measure 3. At the end of measure 3, we have the same pattern again. It also moves to E and D at the beginning of measure 4 before restating the tonic note at the end there of the 4-bar phrase. So once again, we see some of the same characteristics. The total range here between lowest note and highest note in this example is a sixth. In addition to that, we see some scale-wise type movement that's stepping through. In other words, we see just the difference of a second in the first measure. The skip that I mentioned in the second and ultimately third measures is preceded by mostly stepwise motion, the A to B, which is repeated. Even before that, at the beginning of measure 2, there's A to B again. At the beginning of measure 3, it's E to D. So again, lots of stepping around, even though there is a skip present in each of those two measures. And then the last measure, once again, just kind of continues what we did at the beginning of measure 3. So some stepwise motion between the E to D and then the tonic note rounding out that particular phrase. So again, we see some of the same characteristics here in this measure. The shortness of the sections, so to speak, is, I think, pretty well defined by these three examples because of the fact that we get some repetition, even with the skipping in the case of that last example. But we're still seeing the sort of two halves within each of these phrases. And those halves are constructed in such a way that there isn't a lot of jumping around, not a lot of skipping, again, mostly conjunct, stepwise motion. But with just enough beyond that to make things kind of interesting, whether it be ascending scales like example 2 or that skip that's included in example 3. So that's, again, what I just wanted to touch on with some examples to talk a little bit more about vocal melody and those characteristics that help define it, even when you're writing for instruments, as it turns out. At some point, we'll look at some instrumental music too, but for now, I just wanted to share these examples from different genres, different periods, just to sort of highlight some of what has helped define vocal music for many, many centuries. Hope you have a great week. Take care.